Welcome to Fowler Forest Preserve. This is the Woodbury County Conservation Board's first acquisition when it started in the early 1960s. And this is a beautiful place to go looking for woodland wildflowers, especially in the spring. So today we're going on a woodland wildflower hike. So, my name is Dawn Snyder with the Woodbury County Conservation Board, and wildflowers, especially spring wildflowers, are one of my favorites. We have some amazing bloomers here at Fowler Forest, including the bellwort. Bellwort is a beautiful flower in the lily family, and it has a yellow flower that hangs down. So the bellwort's scientific name is uvularia. And uvula, if you think about the back of your throat, I'm not going to open my mouth, but that little dangly thing in the back of your throat is called a uvula. And the flower itself has a nodding flower that's kind of nodding down like a uvula. So that perhaps is why it's got its name. Bellwort, as I said, is in the lily family. It's not necessarily an edible plant, but it's a beautiful spring wildflower. And we don't have it in too many areas in Woodbury County, but I do know that it's here at Fowler Forest. Another lily found in Fowler Forest is a native lily called the Trout Lily, also known as dogtooth violet. Now, the trout lilies are a type of flower that have a single blade typically that come out, and it might turn into two. But the leaf itself, the reason it gets the trout lily name is it kind of has a mottled pattern to it that looks like the coloration on the back of a trout or fish. Trout lily is blooming right here. We've got a couple of them, and look how they're nodding. They're just beautiful little flowers. Again, dogtooth violet is another name for it. It takes at least 7 years for these plants to bloom once you have the tubers, and they have an underground tuber that will bring the shoots up from that. Those tubers are edible, and they were important parts of the diet for our Native Americans and pioneers. But again, we're not harvesting any of our plants here at Fowler Forest. But the nodding little flower there is pretty indicative. You can see hillsides here at Fowler Forest that are completely covered with trout lily leaves. And oftentimes it's hard to find a little blooming flower with it. So I'm excited to see some right here. Another special wildflower called toothwort. Another funny name for it is crinkleroot, because the root of this plant kind of gets shriveled and crinkly, and it's also peppery flavor. So some of our native wildflowers are edible. However, we're not going to be harvesting those for edibility or for eating or harvesting that way today. But our crinkleroot or toothwort, its genus name or scientific name is Dentaria. And if you think about dentist, Dentaria comes from that root name, dentist. It has a white flower, and the leaves are pretty distinctive in that they are kind of dissected, and they come out in a whorl, and you'll see different edges along the edge of the leaf. There'll be little tooth edges in a pretty distinctive pattern. The flowers themselves are in the mustard family, so when the petals are open, those little white petals will have 4 petals, and that's indicative of the mustard family. The other important part of the mustard family is that they will produce a seed capsule with lots of little seeds, and when that seed capsule matures, it'll burst open and the seeds will be spread that way. So this plant is a native wildflower. I've not seen it in Stone State Park in very many areas, but we have it here at Fowler Forest. We also have some wild phlox along our trails, also known as Sweet William. And this is just a beautiful purpley lavender to kind of pink colored wildflower. It has 5 petals. And we talked about the mustard family having 4 petals. These have 5. The plant itself was not used traditionally for herbs or for edibility, but it is a beautiful flower, and it's a great sign of spring. The neat thing about these is the petals themselves of the flowers are kind of twisted, and as they open, they just kind of untwist and unfurl. So it's a neat little woodland wildflower. We also have a prairie phlox version, but this is our woodland phlox or Sweet William. This is a flower here in our forest called blue cohosh. And blue cohosh has kind of a bluish green tint to the leaf. It also has a flower, it's just starting to bloom, that's kind of a greenish yellow with a blue tinge to it as well. The other distinctive feature of this wildflower is those flowers will produce a blue berry. Now it's not edible, but it is a bright blue berry you'll see in the forest later in the summer and into the fall. Blue cohosh traditionally was used as a medicinal type of plant by the pioneers and Native Americans. It was used to aid in childbirth as far as that type of plant. And we have this native wildflower throughout our forest here at Fowler Forest and some of our other forests. I know it's found also at Stone State Park. Dicentra is one of our flowers. It's called, also known as Dutchman's Breeches. And we have a ferny-like plant that has soft petals. There's no hairs on them at all. And with that, we have the beautiful little flower that looks like butterflies or pantaloons from the Dutchmans Breeches. This is a member of the poppy family. It is not an edible plant. In fact, it is poisonous. So we want to make sure and use caution with this plant as far as it's not poisonous to touch, but it would be if you would try to eat it. And the plant itself is one of our first spring bloomers in the forest. And the Dutchman's Breeches, again, there's looks like little butterflies or little pantaloons with our ferny, soft foliage. And this is really an easy one to spot, and it's found throughout our forests here in Fowler Forest and at Stone State Park and Bacon Creek and other areas in Iowa. Bloodroot is one of our very first bloomers in our forests in western Iowa, and we still have some of them blooming here in the forest almost towards the end of April. They are a member of the poppy family as well, and when they first emerge, you'll see their leaves coming up, and then the stem will come up with the flower. And after the flower is matured, you can see the little pod here in between the leaves on the one that's already bloomed and gone to seed, starting to mature. Poppy family, again, I said, and members of the poppy family are not edible. It's poisonous to eat. But the neat thing about why it got its name, bloodroot, has the root itself is kind of, if it gets broken, it oozes a kind of reddish orange sap as though it's bleeding. So that's how it gets its name. It may have been used for dyes and for paints as well, decorative purposes. But the plant itself is one of our first bloomers. It's beautiful spring wildflower, bloodroot. Sweet Sicily is another wildflower that's found in our forest here at Fowler Forest and at Stone State Park. It is a wildflower that's not quite blooming yet. It'll have a small little white flower, clusters of flowers that'll come up from the stem. But one way to identify it is it has compound leaves and they are dissected. The stem itself, or the stalk, has a lot of hairs on it, and they tend to be in purplish in color. They are called wild licorice by some as a nickname because they do have the odor of anise or black licorice. So it's fun to take a little snippet of a leaf and rub it and smell that licorice odor. There is a similar one that will smell not like licorice, but it's a subspecies or a different species of this Osmorrhiza is the genus. So we have the actual Longostylus would be the one for our Sweet Sicily. And when the seed heads are formed after the flowers bloom, they kind of look like little black seeds, and they are also kind of a licorice or wild licorice. So they were used to season food historically by pioneers. Virginia waterleaf is one of the first plants to emerge along the slopes in the forest. However, it has not yet bloomed, and it won't bloom until May and later in May. The plant itself, Virginia waterleaf, comes from the little white spots on the leaves and the axils and the little petals. It looks as though if you would take if you have a cold drink and you put it on a coffee table without a coaster, it would leave a ring, or a water spot. So that's how it gets its name. As the plants grow larger and the leaves get bigger, some of those white spots might fade. But the flower itself is a cluster of pinkish to purpley flowers. The bees and native pollinators love them. The greens, the young greens of these were edible, and the Native Americans ate them in a salad. But for the most part, if you're out in the forest hiking, you can see our ground cover of this Virginia waterleaf throughout our forests, and look for it again to bloom later in May. We have several shrubs in our forest in the shrub underlayer, and this is one of our native shrubs that if you back up into it, you might get goosed. That's the name of the plant, gooseberry, but it does have spines on its stem, and so it could poke you. Those are, it's a very common shrub, and the leaf itself looks a lot like kind of a maple leaf. It has different lobes on it, but right now it's blooming, and on the underside those little flowers are going to turn into a berry, thus the name gooseberry, and the berries themselves will be green, and then they'll turn as they ripen to a purpley color. When they're green, they're very sour, but they're kind of tasty if you like things really sour, but if you wait for them to get riper, they'll have a sweeter taste. We're used a lot in pies and jams and jellies, but this is one of our native shrubs called the gooseberry. We have another shrub found in our understory, and this one's another delicious one. It's called wild raspberry, and actually it's a wild black raspberries. They're just starting to get their leaves, and the leaves themselves have a grouping of compound leaf and 3, but it's one that you can touch as far as it's not poisonous like poison ivy. However, the branches or brambles all do have spines and thorns on them, so you'll come into contact with them, you'll know them right away. But that purplish, reddish, bluish color is very indicative of a raspberry bush. Later in June, you will have luscious, deep purple berries as they ripen if you can beat the birds to them. I've been talking about some of our plants as far as our wildflowers go. There's no harvesting or digging of our wildflowers, but it is legal to harvest in our Woodbury County parks nuts, berries. So when the berries are ripe, you can harvest the berries, and mushrooms would also be another thing you could harvest. You want to make sure you know the species before you harvest any of them, and never take more than you need. Always leave some for the birds and others. So you're out and you're running through the edge of the fields and you feel a burn. You may have come across a patch of wild stinging nettle. We have 2 types of nettles in the forest, and one of those is stinging nettle. The other is a woodland nettle. They're similar in the fact that they both have little stinging hairs on the leaves and on the stems, and in that they have a type of oil called urtica, means to burn, so it has a type of formic acid. So it's basically like little hypodermic needles that you come into contact with potentially when you brush against that with your bare skin. So it's good to wear long pants, long sleeves when you're out walking, but it gets to be warm in the summertime. It's tough to do. So take a look at these 2 plants. We've got a couple comparisons and contrasts. Our woodland nettle has usually shorter stature. Right now they're short because it's early in the year, but the leaves themselves have a lot more hairs on them than a stinging nettle. They'll have some hairs on the leaf axils underneath and also along the edges, where our stinging nettles, you'll see hairs on them as well. The other thing about the wood nettle is their leaf, they have the strong serrations or toothed edges, but they tend to be a little bit more oval shaped, not as pointed, whereas our stinging nettle leaf, if you see that, it has a very distinct edge that's pointed. So stinging nettles will also get quite tall. In fact, this is some of the stalk from last year's stinging nettle that's left over from last year. Both of the nettle plants will not have a pretty flower as far as very showy and colorful. They'll kind of be nondescript greenish, yellowish colors. In fact, they might look a little more like wiggly caterpillars. But we've got our woodland nettle and our stinging nettle right here side by side, both of which are edible. You think, oh, I don't want to eat something that's going to burn me. Obviously, you'd want to potentially harvest them, the nettle tops, when they're very young and tender. And they also recommend blanching them to take out the burning. But they can be eaten raw as an edible salad. They are high in vitamin A and vitamin C. And they also have, the stinging nettles especially, have a lot of fibers in them. So they were used a lot for cordage or rope. So poison ivy is a woody plant, and we have it growing as a vine along this oak tree. Look how the root hairs are very prominent. It can get quite thick in diameter, but it also has some smaller tendrils that are coming up. And I must say that all parts of the plant do have the oil that you can become sensitive to. So you want to be sure to not touch it, or if you do, you want to wash really well after you're out on your forays in the forest. Another thing about this is if you cut for firewood and burn, you can release the oils into the air and then breathe them into your lungs and have some pretty bad complications with the irritations in your lungs. So keep that in mind when you're out and about if you do cut firewood. But this vine is a really good example of how poison ivy can be so thick and prominent and have all those root hairs. And the branches that come up look like they're kind of lifting up and coming upwards, kind of like my professor used to call them witch's fingers coming up out of the tree. It'll be beautiful in the fall, though, when it has its big green leaves and they turn red and bright orange and yellow. So very tempting to collect those leaves, but make sure you get to know this plant and not collect it or touch it if you can at all help it. I do want to say as well, all of our spring flowers, we call them ephemerals because they are here for fleeting moments. Ephemeral means for a very short time. If you think about, our trees are just starting to open up with their leaves, and the sunlight is able to penetrate through our canopy right now. That's why we have such a great resurgence of our spring wildflowers, because the sunlight. Flowers and plants obviously need sun. So we have a chance to see them here for fleeting moments in the spring. And because they are treasures, we also don't allow any harvesting of our spring wildflowers. So that means no digging, no replanting them elsewhere. They stay. Fowler Forest is a Fowler Forest preserve. So we're preserving this area for other people to enjoy. So take only pictures and memories, but leave our beautiful flowers here for other people to enjoy. Thanks for joining us today on our virtual wildflower hike through Fowler Forest Preserve. I hope you get outside and enjoy nature in a safe fashion.